So welcome for this morning lecture on introduction to the nitrogen cycle. So my name is Ralf Kiese. I'm working in this institute. I'm head of the working group Ecosystem Metafluxes, and we are dealing mostly with nitrogen, but for sure also with carbon and greenhouse gas emissions. So what you can see already on this slide is that nitrogen the synonym is this N here is putting threats to the environment, and nitrogen is quite a complex issue. You see here industry, we see agriculture, putting fertilizer, and this could be some natural systems, and this is all somehow interlinked. So with this big N in the middle, the subtitle of this talk could also be nitrogen, too much of a good thing. So, and that's kind of the issue what we deal with in the next 1 hour. So if you look to a publication by Rockström et al. Published in Nature 2009, indeed nitrogen was identified as one of the most important threats to the Earth at the moment, and this is under this kind of keywords, planetary boundaries. There is for sure climate change, but if you see not as important as the nitrogen perturbation, and there's this biodiversity losses. But we will see later on that nitrogen is also linked to climate change and to biodiversity, so they are all kind of linked. Now, if we look to the outline of the talk, so I will talk first about nitrogen. We need to see the components and the reservoirs, because that's important to understand the global nitrogen cycle. So we go from the natural cycle then towards human perturbation and the consequences. And in the second part of the talk, I will give some examples. It's basically on work what we do here, field studies and also biogeochemical modeling, and then at the end there will be a summary and some conclusions. Now, if we look to the reservoirs and components, we see there's a lot of no's, which means this is not reactive. So we have nitrogen in the mantle and in the crust, which is not reactive, and we have it in the atmosphere because 78% of the atmosphere is N2, but unluckily this N2 has a triple bound, so which fixes the two components very much together, so it's non-reactive. So that means we have 50% of the availability to the ecosystems in the atmosphere, but this is not reactive. Then if we look on soils, there's a little bit more, but the turnover times are rather low, and then we have the biosphere, either marine or terrestrial, where we have lower turnover times, but the reservoirs in the so-called terrestrial ecosystems is rather small compared to soils and to these non-reactive parts in the atmosphere. What is also important is that the Earth's nitrogen stocks, they stay constant, but the chemical forms can vary, and this is bringing me to the keyword of reactive nitrogen, because we need this reactive nitrogen, and if you just look on the reactive nitrogen, then we have these components, for example nitrate, which can be transported in water, and nitrate. Then we have a laughing gas, N2O, which is a gas, and we have ammonia, and we have all organic forms, and here you see examples of amino acids. So this reactive nitrogen, this is the main components when we talk about ecosystem processes, and this reactive nitrogen is influencing process in plants, in soils, in water bodies, and also in the atmosphere, and is essential for the distribution in the environment. So we will just have a look to this later on. Now, if we start again with the global nitrogen cycle, the natural nitrogen cycle, then we have this huge reservoir in the atmosphere. So now we need to get this nitrogen into the ecosystems, and I was talking about that this triple bonds is quite stable. So with lightning we can oxidize it, and lightning is one of the pathways which is natural deposition to get nitrogen into either aquatic or terrestrial ecosystems. The other way is what you might have heard is nitrogen fixing bacteria on roots and in soil. So we have non-symbiotic, which could be say cyanobacteria, but symbiotic, that's just a picture here where we have bacteria associated to roots, and they fix nitrogen, the N2, and they bring it into ammonia. What is quite interesting is that this bacteria, they live, or the fixing does work only without oxygen, and this is going back to the time when the Earth didn't have oxygen in the atmosphere. So before the plants could kind of develop, there was already this bacteria fixing nitrogen out of an atmosphere with oxygen. So this is one of the limitations, because we have oxygen now, that these microbes, they need to save their place where they do this fixation out of oxygen. Now with ammonia, we can feed plants with it, or the plants take this as a macronutrient. But then we have, from ammonia, we have nitrification, which is an aerobic process which converts ammonia or ammonium into nitrate. And this is taking place in the soil, but like I said, nitrate is highly soluble in water, so we can transport this also in aquatic ecosystems. Now, nitrate can be also taken up by plants as ammonia, but nitrate in the process of denitrification, which is a strict anaerobic process, can be converted back into N2. So there's a few steps in denitrification. The last step is N2, and ideally we just get the N2 then back into the atmosphere, and that's the cycle. Natural cycle, like I said, very important is that the only two pathways getting nitrogen is nitrogen fixation and lightning. And nitrogen fixation is about, it can be, if you have acacia as 150 kilogram N per hectare, but so a natural kind of forest ecosystem which doesn't have this symbiotic nitrogen fixation is about 5 to 10 kilograms. So it's rather low amounts, and lightning might be about 2 to 3 kilograms. So now, if we take this further, we do now fertilization. So we want to grow plants, and fertilization rates are going up to 100, 200, 300, 500 kilograms. So we add a lot of nitrogen. Then this is going again in the ammonia pool, and then we start the whole cycle again, so that we get also the plants fed by animals. And from this kind of production, we produce waste and residues, which are in organic form. And if they are mineralized, we get again into the ammonia pool, and then we can kind of speed up the whole cycle. And finally, what is important, like I said, the denitrification is not only producing N2 but also N2O, and this is a potent greenhouse gas. So this is somehow the relation of the global nitrogen cycle, the natural one with very low inputs, and kind of the perturbation where we have high inputs. Now, if we just keep in mind that denitrification and nitrification are the most important processes in terrestrial ecosystems, they mostly happen in the soil. This is a very simplified scheme of the nitrogen cycle. So what we know nowadays, and this is the nitrification, and this is the denitrification. There's a whole bunch of more processes, and what you see is also that we have organic ammonium. This is hydroxylamine, nitrate, nitrate, and all these kind of forms, and they can be produced in oxidative processes, but also again produced in reductive processes, and you can somehow also see that something which is produced here can be taken up by another process. So what I do not want to go very much into detail is just that nitrogen cycling is very, very complex in compared to carbon cycle, for example, where you have respiration and photosynthesis, and you have organic and CO2. So there's a lot more in the nitrogen cycle, and we know about this by molecular methods, and also we can screen DNA so that we get some ideas, but we are very, very far away to really understand this whole cycle. I'm talking later on about models and how what we take into account in the models, because in the models we cannot take all these processes, and some of them are of sometimes also of minor importance. Now, just to human perturbation, and this is also kind of looking back about understanding nitrogen cycling in a historical way. If we go back to 1836, we have Jean-Baptiste Boursignon, and he was the first on the planet kind of realizing that nitrogen is an important component for plant growth. And if we go further, then we have some Germans here in 1888, and these guys were the first one who realized that bacteria can do this nitrogen fixation by legumes, and this was then also already implemented into agriculture. What you see here is this is the population here just numbers of people. If we go further on, then there was this guy, Sir William Crookes. He was the president of the British Association for the Advancement of Sciences, and he was in 1900 realizing that this nitrogen is limiting and that the world is running out of nitrogen. So if there's no other process than this biological nitrogen fixation, still the population is rather low. And then we kind of exploded the whole system with, again, two German guys, Fritz Haber and Karl Bosch, which were just getting Nobel Prizes also because they developed a method to do produce nitrogen fertilizer out of the atmosphere again too. And now the whole situation changed completely, because if you look now, this is the start of the Haber-Bosch here. This is the chemical nitrogen production, and with this we could really increase the population. But you see also that the nitrogen inputs to kind of, if you want, natural situation has dramatically increased. We could increase at the same time the population. Now, if we look on this, what does this mean in numbers? This is just a different scheme showing the same thing. This is the world population increase, and this is the average fertilizer input increase from 1900 to 2000. And if we look now, this is the world population if we wouldn't have Haber-Bosch. So it would be only 30% of what we have now. And if you take the number further, that means at the same time that at the moment 50% of the world population relies on the Haber-Bosch synthetification of the nitrogen. World population. I didn't really look this one up, so I could check, but most likely they just did a difference to what you have with Haber-Bosch. It doesn't really fit because you have 50% and the 30%. It doesn't get to 100. So good question. But the main message is that 50% of the current population is really fed by Haber-Bosch. This is people realize that nitrogen is a threat to an environment, and there is some kind of reduction in fertilizer input, more efficient agriculture. So that's one of the reasons why it might not increase at the moment. But you need to take into account that there's many countries, for example in Africa. We talk about the situation in Europe and Asia. In Africa, there's almost no fertilizer applications at the moment. So from that point of view, there's really this two bolts in terms of nitrogen perturbation, because in Africa we still have too less nitrogen for increasing crop production. Okay, so let's go further. If you look on these numbers here, this is just the increase in synthetic fertilizer. These are numbers now for the EU, and you see just in 1900 that most of the fixed nitrogen was by legumes, which is in line with the slides before. And then we have increased dramatically the synthetic fertilizer applications. This is N2 fixed by industry and traffic. This is combustion processes. And what we have also in Europe is that because we have this high animal production systems, so we need to import crops to feed the animals, for example, from Brazil. And with this crop, we need not only take carbon into our markets, but also nitrogen. And this is just a very important one, just by global transfer of nitrogen stocks. And what you see is that we more or less have kind of 4 times higher inputs in Europe as we had in 1900. So now this is again a scheme showing that nitrogen cycle is very complex. We talked about these components. We have gaseous forms, we have nitrogen which can be transported, and if we just take the example of fertilization here, then we have this turnover process, but you see there can be, with fertilization, we can have also ammonia volatilization in the atmosphere. then we can get redeposition with rainfall in oxidized or in reductive forms. We can have this nitrate transportation into aquatic bodies, and so we have this so-called nitrogen cascade. So that's the problem of the nitrogen. Once you apply it on a single field, it won't stay there. Everything which is not taken up can be either transported via the air and redeposited, or via the water. And then we kind of interlink this intensively managed systems with also native systems which haven't had this high amount of nitrogen, and then we cause all these problems. If you look on the EU, so this is the slide I showed before. We are now here, and this is the losses. So you see what we see, that the losses have increased from 1900 to 2000. And again, what you see here, I just talked about. This is the nitrates transported into water bodies. It's more or less about the half. Then we have N2O emissions, which are rather small, compared ammonia volatilization, which is driving the redeposition mostly, and the combustion processes, which are also involved in the redeposition. Now, why is the nitrogen not completely taken up? So this is just a balance what I did from Europe. You see here the different countries of Europe, and this is Germany here. This is the Netherlands, and so we see that Germany at the moment, this is numbers from 2005 to 2008, is applying in average 215 kilogram of nitrogen per hectare. You see the Netherlands, they do a little bit more. But if we now compare how much is harvested, so how much is basically taken up by the plants, then we see it's only 125 kilograms of nitrogen. So if we do now the difference, we have 90 kilograms, which is staying in the environment and which is kind of prone to be transported around. So we talk about an efficiency of 60%. So in a production process, this is a very, very low number, but we talk about biological processes. Nevertheless, that's indicating if we have a 60% efficiency, that we might can do something to increase this efficiency, and then we would have less export into the environment. Now, we take this a little bit further, and this is now not numbers in kilograms, this is just normalized to percent. So we have 100% fertilizer input, we have 60% efficiency with crop harvest, so that means we have 40% of losses, which is just mixed up here, so it should be just the other way around. So any guess from you how these numbers, like the losses, the red number, will develop over here? Do you have any idea? Will this be lower numbers, as high, or do you have any ideas? It's a little bit shocking, because if you look at this, then if you, for example, eat beef, then from the 100% of nitrogen which was fertilized, it's only ending up below 10% in the product. So more than 90% stays in the environment. It's a little bit better for poultry, eggs, but also dairy products are not so very good. So that means that is already indicating a little bit towards that. One thing what one could do is just thinking about the diet. So vegetarians are doing much better than if you eat beef all the time. At the last column you see the global agriculture. So Europe is a quite developed part of the world. In global agriculture we have an efficiency of 40%. So Europe was the 60%. Now the consequences, like I said, the nitrogen is not staying in the environment, and we have this nitrogen depositions, and in Germany or everywhere in the world a natural nitrogen deposition number was about 5 to 8 kilograms per hectare in year. If you look now to these numbers, then we have, this is going up to 70 kilograms, and what you see here is just, this is the place where we do this intensive animal product, where we have this intensive animal production systems. So we have all this manure there, it's volatilized, and the ammonia is just redeposited. So that means even if you are very close to one of these farms, the deposition can go up to 100 to 150 kilograms, which is in the same range as what we fertilize our agricultural fields. And if you think about that, there's a forest nearby, there is indeed consequences not only to the kind of nitrogen cycle of components, but also to biodiversity issues. What you see as well is that It also depends on the surface what you have of the trees. So conifers have all year round needles. The broadleaves throw it away, so we are getting a little bit lower numbers. Semi-naturalist grasslands and shrublands, there's a lower surface, so the deposition is then a little bit lower. Now, this is a summary what I talked about. So all the threats what we have if we have this excess nitrogen, we can get this increased N2 emissions, which is a greenhouse gas. So this is kind of the climatic aspect. I talked a little bit about ecosystems and biodiversity. We can have problems with water quality. It could be in biodiversity aspect, but also nitrate is polluting drinking water. Air quality, NOx is involved in ozone production, so that's also one thing where the nitrogen cycle is linked to. And in soils, we can have acidification. If you put ammonia and this is converted to nitrate, then there is one proton staying in the soil, which is compensated by an export of magnesium or potassium or kalium, so just by a base cation. So this is why farmers sometimes put lime onto their fields to increase the pH again. So this is kind of the summary of these environmental issues. Now, this is the last slide for the first part of the talk, is that if we put costs on it, then we see that, for example, this human health due to ozone and particulate matter, small particles, it's about 10 to 30 kilograms. And other issues like climate change is about 5 to 15. It's quite tough to get these numbers, but anyway, there was some people trying to do this. The important thing is, even if there's high uncertainties, if you compare this to the price what fertilizer is, then 1 kilogram of N is approximately 1.5 euros. So to buy fertilizer in total is much cheaper than any prices what we see here, what we have for the costs. So this is going a little bit into this debate if the nitrogen fertilizers are too small, because they are one of the troublemakers of all of these environmental issues. And some people even think about that we should put tax on, but then food prices will increase, and the question still then is for us if we will accept this. So at the moment there is really no action going into that. But I think it's important to just to tell that the product what you buy is much cheaper than all the costs what you get with it. Good. So I'm going now to the examples, and I just want to link this again with the terrestrial nitrogen cycle. This was kind of tackled by some slides before, but we have basically organic matter which is fed by plant litter production and death of microbes, and with ammonification we get ammonia, nitrification we turn it into nitrate, and denitrification is turning it into ideally N2, but it could be also N2O and NO, these gases. What is important that we have always the plants and the microbes in the soil, they are competing for these nitrogen stocks there. So that means, for example, if we cut out the plants, then we have access for the microbes, and then they can turn it over, and we might increase N2O emissions. And I will give some examples. The same is true for nitrate leaching here. And again, like I said, the perturbation happens due to increased atmospheric N deposition and fertilization rates. And in the original form we had only this N2 fixation by microbial biomass. Good. And to make it complete, this is in agriculture, if you put ammonium fertilizer, this can volatilize into ammonia. Now, first a positive impact, because forests are nitrogen limited, and if you just look over all places of Europe, and there was a lot of green color also in the deposition map of Germany, so it's not everywhere that we have these really extraordinary high depositions. So that means we are still stimulating forest growth by this additional nitrogen coming from deposition. So this was an effort by colleagues, Wim de Vries et al., who just recently published this paper, and they calculated the increase in forest growth just by using CN ratios. So what you just use basically is a function of available nitrogen. This is indicated here that only 25% of the deposition will stay in the ecosystem. This is true for boreal forests and temperate forests, and in tropical forests it's even lower because, for example, we have higher denitrification and we produce more gaseous losses. And then you look into allocation fractions, which basically says how much nitrogen, and this is linked to the carbon, if you have photosynthesis, is put into stems, into coarse woods, into woody parts, and all these other components. And what we can measure is the CN ratio of all of these components. And with this, we can then calculate, and this is the table here, that for any kilogram of nitrogen, we can fix 21 kilograms of carbon, which will finally end up in the stems. And what you see as well here in the soil, for example, this is due to increased litter production. 1 kilogram is nitrogen is responsible for about 13 kilogram of carbon, which will be sequestered in the soil. So if you extrapolate this for the whole Europe situation with nitrogen deposition maps, then we are coming at the current deposition scenario to about 300 teragrams C per year. 60% is sequestered additionally in the wood and 40% in the soil. This is about 3 to 8% of the global of the European, so that's wrong, European forest net ecosystem productivity. So a rather small number. I'm just putting this because there were some publications, they used different approaches and they came up to numbers of 30-40%. So, but there's some evidence also by more field studies using stable isotopes that we talk about this below 10%. Nevertheless, significant. One thing what we need to take into account is that this is the current situation, and this N1, N2, and 3 are different status of saturation. So here we have still a high retention efficiency, which was the 25% what I've said, but if we add more and more nitrogen, this efficiency will go down and until we reach N3, where we have really a saturation, and if it goes below 0, that means we might have even a net release of nitrogen out of these ecosystems. This is translated into the net primary productivity, if you want the forest growth, so that you see under this kind of nitrogen limited conditions where we mostly still are in most of the systems, we have this increase, but if we get into saturation, the response curve is going down. So that means the 7-8% of increase are valid for this situation, but if we continue with this higher nitrogen depositions, this effect will level out over time. Good, field studies. This is our own kind of long-term site. This is a spruce forest, and it has the number is down here. The nitrogen deposition is around 30 kilograms. So this is already quite a significant number. So we are close to nitrogen saturation. So there is a lot of nitrate leaching, and what we investigated here is now a little bit linked to land use change, if you want, and in that case more to forest management. So what happens with N2O emissions and nitrate leaching if you do a selective cutting or if you do a clear cut? And we have investigated that for quite a long time. What you see is the black dots is the control, the green dots is the selective cutting, and the red dots is the clear cut. So the clear cut has happened here, and what you see is that until 2006, where the treatments are just at the same level again, clear cut, selective cutting, and the control, the N2O emissions, because we kind of cut this competition between microbes and the forest on this nitrogen components, N2O emissions have increased dramatically. The same is if you look here for nitrate leaching, but the time axis is a little bit different, so we are just going up here. So this is, and if you take this into account, then there's carbon sequestered, and if we do a full greenhouse gas balance, and we do not account only for the CO2, but we would include N2O, then this kind of, if you want, 5-6 years will reduce the CO2 sequestration by 20 to 30%, which is quite a significant number, because N2O is a quite potent greenhouse gas. Now, this is another field study. This N2O emissions, in our case, we are measuring them with chambers. So you close the chambers, and then you can measure the increase of gas concentrations, and then just by the slope of the increase, you finally get the numbers. And this is an example over 1.5 years on a maize field. Blue is without fertilization, and we just see here that the emissions are much smaller compared to the fertilized treatments. In Hügelwald, before the slide, we had emissions up to 300 micrograms per square meter an hour. In these agricultural systems, we are here with 600-700, but that can go even up to 1,000, 2,000, just because we add more nitrogen. Now, this numbers in Germany is that 6% of the total greenhouse gas emissions are caused by N2O, and the most important thing is that agriculture contributes to about 70%. So there's a high mitigation potential in agriculture, and this is what we investigate. And you can use, for example, inhibitors, which are kind of reducing ammonia volatilization. This is just the treatment here, that this one is reducing ammonia volatilization, and this is now the cumulative N2O emissions. This is the control, and like with this reduction of ammonia volatilization, we have achieved something, that we get less ammonia into the atmosphere, but that means on the other side that more nitrogen is staying in the soil. So that means overall the N2O emissions are higher then. So, and there's another treatment which is this one down here, which is 70% of fertilizer application to the normal one, and this was also 100%. So we reduced the fertilizer application by 30%, and we use this ammonia volatilization reduction, and then we are indeed lower than the control treatment, and we got almost to the same yields. So the message is, if we use inhibitors, then and we increase with this the availability of nitrogen in the soil, we most likely need to reduce fertilization rates. Otherwise, we will keep more nitrogen in the soil, so we won't have ammonia volatilization, but at the same time we would produce more N2O, which is another harmful substance. Now to biogeochemical modeling. So this is just a scheme about how biogeochemical models works. In our group, we use the landscape, the NDC model. In principle, you use just ecological drivers, climate, soil, vegetation, human impact. You have a plant growth module. This can be either for arable, grassland, or forest. Then you calculate soil climate, as temperature, soil moisture, mineralization, which gives the substrates of carbon and nitrogen. With soil temperature, soil moisture, and pH, then we drive this process in the nitrogen cycle of nitrification and denitrification. Because this is an aerobic process and this is anaerobic, we have this anaerobic balloon, which just tells us from the oxygen concentration what we calculate, how much is anaerobic and how much is aerobic, and then we split between these two processes. And finally, we can calculate nitrate leaching and all these kind of emissions. Also, how much the forest or is growing and how much yields we can produce. So quite general scheme of any kind of process-based ecosystem model. What can you do with it? This is now arable site, Gebesee in Germany. This is a grassland site in Unsingen. This is measured soil temperature and simulated rainfall. This is the soil moisture. In that case, there is some problems with the model. Red is simulated, but in that case, it's better. And then if we have measurements, this is the plant biomass produced, matches very well. This is ammonium nitrate concentrations here. Always the dots are the measurements, and the line is the simulation. It fits also quite well. And if you look on the numbers, they are at least for N2O quite different. So we have much higher N2O emissions from this grassland field because we put more fertilizer compared to this one. So what we do then with this model, that this is the site scale validation, and if we have 10, 15, 20 of these data sets, there's not that much more in the world where we have all these components measured, and we have this from different kind of soils and climates, then we can be somehow sure that if we use the model in a upscaling approach or in scenarios that we are not doing that wrong. So one thing was in reducing nitrogen or N2O emissions by inhibitors. Another example, this is a study what we have done in South Korea. What you see here is in Germany the average fertilization application was about 200 kilograms. Here we have 300, and with the model it's much higher. We could just show that keeping the same yields, we can reduce the fertilizer for cabbage from 300 to 120 kilograms. Because they have very small fields and they have one bag of fertilizer and they just put the bag of fertilizer to a small field because they don't want to carry it back. That's the simple reason why it's over-fertilized. And with this model, we have a chance to give some evidence. What we could also do is that they do one application just once a year. So if you do 2 splits, if you divide it, this is more kind of demand-driven fertilization. That's also helping to induce. But we could also see if we do 3 splits, then the reduction in nitrogen emissions is not so very helpful. This is a specific situation there. So you can evaluate with this model agricultural management suitable to the given conditions what you have at the site. Field studies, nitrate leaching. This was now a spatial extrapolation where we used our model for whole Germany, and you see here nitrate leaching this is just the spatial distribution. We have at some sites nitrate leaching which is exceeding 40 kilograms, which is in the same range what arables can be, and in mean nitrate leaching rates was about 5.5 kilogram, but we get this elevated emissions already if we put more than 15 to 20 kilograms, and we have this strong correlation of nitrogen deposition and nitrate leaching. The highest rates we found at sites where the forest floor CN ratio is smaller than 25%. So again, the CN ratio, like I said, the more narrow it is, the more nitrogen rich it is, and the 25% seems to be a threshold for nitrate leaching and N2O emissions. So that's also an indication. If you measure out in the field and your forest has a CN ratio of 30, then it's okay in terms of nitrogen. If you go below 25, then this is pointing towards saturation of an ecosystem, of a forest ecosystem. It's sometimes difficult to validate the simulations. We have done this in that case with some measurements, which was done in Bavaria, and we couldn't really go to the specific points, but if you make classes of nitrate leaching 0 to 5, 5 to 15, and larger than 15, then you see the measured is the red color, and this is kind of the red pattern that we quite match quite nicely for Bavaria, which was somehow also a validation that the model applications seem to be all right and could be used maybe for some further guidance. I think I just skip this one. This was a little bit of biodiversity aspect. So what you can do as well is now, like I said, if we have this enrichment of nitrogen, and this is again indicated here with the CN ratio and also base saturation. So if you look on plant communities, and this is just different plant communities, this might have been 50 years ago the plant community on a given site. No, it's this way. This was 50 years ago where we had this wide CN ratios and the given base saturation, and now with nitrogen deposition scenarios we can use our model to calculate the change in CN ratio and in base saturation, and then you can kind of for example, for this ecosystem, if you go out of this kind of green area, it's not stable anymore. So with this and biodiversity models with an ecosystem or biogeochemical ecosystem model and linking to biodiversity models, we can somehow calculate shifts in biodiversity, and if you want to go into management, you could even say that a species community here, if you have now if it was this one and we are now here in this range, then you can give foresters, if you want, some ideas which plant might grow better or not. Field studies, again, this is climate, this before was nitrate leaching and biodiversity. This is a study we have done in a forest in Austria together with the Environmental Protecting Agency in Vienna. And what you see again here is that we have, after clear cuts, this elevated nitrogen leachings. And always if there is forest thinnings, we also increase nitrate leaching. Then with the reinitiation of the understory with increased forest growth, we get to lower nitrate leaching rates. And once the forest reaches maturity and the growth is smaller, then again we get some higher nitrate concentrations in the seepage water. Overall, these concentrations are not so very high, and the motivation of this study was this is a karst region, and they just wanted to know if forest management is putting harms to nitrate concentration in drinking water, because in a karst environment you have very fast water flows, and the soils cannot capture out the nitrate efficiently. And if you look on climate change, what you see then is this is a climate change scenario, and this is just the difference between the current and the climate change, is that climate change will increase the nitrate export just when you do this kind of clear cut. Then we have summer droughts. This is in the second phase, which are somehow delaying the reinitialization of the young forests, which is also then causing higher nitrate concentrations compared to the current situation. And in the mature status, we are below the line, so we are having less nitrate leaching, because under climate change conditions in that forest, it's a mountainous forest, the forests are growing faster. So the message is that climate change is not really making the nitrate leaching problematic in these forests very worse, that there must be some activity. So good. Now the world is, the simulations have been all one-dimensional, and the problem is that the world is not one-dimensional. One-dimensional means we just simulate one column and there is no interaction. If we go to these slopes, then we have lateral transports of nitrates, and if we do just one column, then this is just not really the truth. And you can also imagine there's kind of farms that we can have this volatilization of nitrogen. It can be redeposited in these riparian zones, etc. So patchwork of land uses with we have patchworks of land uses with own reactive nitrogen sink and source characteristics. In such landscapes, and that's also in the landscapes where we live, this nitrogen is highly managed. It's transferred, emitted, and redeposited. And we have intensive interactions and transformations at landscape elements. And this is one thing very roughly now that we are at the moment linking our biogeochemical model, the nitrogen part, to hydrological models that we can really calculate this transport. And you could even take it further. You can also link our models to atmospheric models, which then calculate redeposition. So that's at the moment one direction what we go for. So you have a hydrological model and a biogeochemical model, and they just talk to each other, and then you can run it on a landscape scale. I might just go very quickly over this one. So we have the metrology, and with the hydrological model we get the soil hydrology, for example, water contents depending on landscape position, lateral flows, and this is a catchment, and this is just indicating the water flows with this arrows now. And what we can now just calculate is here nitrate turnover, nitrate concentrations, and with again the hydrological model we can calculate this nitrate leaching. So if we cut through this slope here, then one thing what you could do, this is just now a kind of a vertical hill slope. Basically what you see here, if we fertilize an arable field, we increase the nitrate in the soil, which can be transported laterally down to the riparian zone, and then we can, for example, this is N2O here, we can get N2O emissions, which is not N2O emissions because fertilization here, it's because fertilization up the hill and transportation of nitrates into riparian zones. You could even think about how to design riparian zones that we can just catch up all the import of nitrogen, that we minimize this N2 emissions or the nitrogen export into the aquatic system. Now, towards the very last slides, this is also a landscape, and validation of these models on landscape scale is also quite tough because you need a lot of measurements. But you can use is stable isotopes, and the very simple message is that always, if you have a turnover, the heavy stable isotope, the heavy form in terms of nitrogen, we have 14N and 15N. The 15N will stay in the soil, and if you have gaseous export, the lighter fractions will go. So that's just indicated by the colors. The atmosphere has a signature of 0, so that means if we have turnover, we are going to the more heavy ones, to the plus ones in the soil, and we also get this enrichment from yellow. Not and we see that the lighter ones, the gases are just disappearing. So we can somehow use this isotopes also on a landscape scale to validate these models in a way, and also to look on turnover rates. Now, this is one slide, and this is one of the last ones now. We can use these stable isotopes also because what I said before, we have crop production, we feed animals, and there we have the same principles, that the nitrogen ending up in the animals will be heavier. This is just indicated here, and fish are even on a longer kind of food chain, if you want. So it's enriched, and if you go to fruits and maize, so it's not that heavy. So what we can do with this, and we have done this by collecting fingernails of people. So if you analyze a fingernail, you get a 13C and 15N ratio. And what you see as well is that with maize and sugarcane, we are approaching to heavier 13C values as to fruits and legumes. So if you give me your fingernail and we analyze it, that's the message. We can tell you what you eat. And what you see here is that most of the people still eat a lot of meat, so at least in this situation. Good. Coming back to this in a minute. So summary and conclusions. Nitrogen cycle is very complex. We have a lot of different forms, organic, inorganic forms, reactive forms. They are transported along ecosystem compartments. We have excess nitrogen. There's these problems of all these kind of threats to the environment. If you are interested in, most of the stuff is really nicely summarized in the European Nitrogen Assessment. There's these different parts, and all of them can be downloaded by, there's PDFs, so that's quite worth, if you're interested, to have a look to this. Now, what can we do? Improved N efficiency in plant production with precision farming would be one thing. There's kind of keywords like demand-driven fertilization, optimized timing of management actions. That's also one thing what we plan to use the model. So you could, for example, take weather forecast for the next 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and you could calculate with this ideal situations when to put the fertilizer. For example, in this South Korean study, we had sandy soils, and if you have a monsoon rain just afterwards, after you put the fertilizer, then it doesn't make that much sense. So that's also one idea. And there's other issues like cover crops, cash crops, and also the storage of these organic fertilizers, manure. They can be done quite a lot. Another thing is improved nitrogen efficiency in livestock farming. Then nitrogen optimized landscape. So I was having this example of riparian zones, and we could even also think about where to put a maize field and where to put some bioenergy production systems. So we could use models in a way to think a bit more clever rather than to just put it there. Energy savings, this was kind of any energy we burn, we produce NOx, and reduced meat consumption. So that's maybe the most simple one on a personal level. And now I'm coming really to the last slide, is the very disappointing thing on this is that black is people from the institute, and green, it's more like going into fish No, it's the other way around. So green is people from the institute, and black is, we had this open day in Garmisch, is kind of the Garmisch population. There was a lot of retired people, so that means even like I told you, and I still know by my own, you should eat less meat. It seems that scientists are eating still more meat, at least in Garmisch, than the local population, and the local population is eating a lot of meat. I don't know if you had the chance to eat a Schweinshaxe, they are as big like this in Garmisch. So the last message is, so it's tough, but I think sometimes there's a time for change, and anyone can do something. Thanks. We do this more and more. So when I started, it was all meat, but if you go to conferences, this is more and more going into vegetarian food, which is good. Oh, this is another funny one. I think this is either the dog of Alfred, or the cats of HP. I think it's the cats of HP. And so there was some speculation what is in the food for cats. So I think it's the cat of HP because he was keen on knowing what his cats are doing. But this is by the way, this is Klaus. He is living in the tropics, so that means his meat is more produced from maize than from wheat, and he's eating still a lot of meat. So still in Africa, you can get this kind of imprint, and it depends. I mean, there's still a history, so it's about 1 year what you get with your fingernail. One thing, it was somehow related also to Christmas, and this kind of higher level of meat could be some bias of Christmas. I didn't. Can you speak a little bit louder? No. That's what I said. It's about half a year. It's an interval of half a year, and there was Christmas in between. So it's not that I can tell you what you have eaten yesterday. So what you can do is with hairs you can do it, because hairs are growing faster than fingernails. So by just knowing how fast hairs are growing, so in my situation it's difficult, but with longer hairs you have the chance just to go back, and then there could be at least some monthly averages. So you should see it if you change from heavy eating meat to a vegetarian. You should see it in a hair after a month or two. This is also done. I mean, this isotope things. There's more isotopes. This is done if you have a murdered person. They also look on these isotopes. Sometimes if they found a person and no one knows where she was or he was coming from, if you look on the oxygen and water vapor isotopes, you can just tell the climatic conditions where they are. So you can say tropical or European or whatever. So it's and you can use it also, like there was this wine punching issues, and you can use stable isotopes. Also, for example, for champagne, you can only call a champagne if the champagne is really from the Champagne region. But because the price for champagne is so high, some people try to sell champagne, and then if you look on the isotopes of water and oxygen, you can really say this is the Champagne region signal, and if it was coming from US, then you would see it. So that's quite a nice thing, and we are trying to use it more in also in environmental science, and also ratios of isotopes and things.